And welcome back to Read Aloud. We're reading from The Right of Nations to Self-Determination. If you like this content, feel free to support. We're going to read from Chapter 2, The Historically Concrete Presentation of the Question. This is assuming you've read Chapter 1, and having read Chapter 1 is assuming you've read a previous work, something else, Stalin's Marxism and the National Question. Excuse me. Marxism and the National Question. Hopefully you've read that, Chapter 1, as well. And now we're going to read from Chapter 2. The historically concrete presentation of the question. The first paragraph represents the most important theoretical contribution by Lenin in the chapter. Namely, he says, the categorical requirement of Marxist theory in investigating any social question is that it be examined within definite historical limits, and if it refers to a particular country, that is, the national program for a given country, that account be taken of the specific features distinguishing that country from others in the same historical epoch. And in using Rosa Luxemburg's writing as his primary vector for attacking similar arguments for, quote, losing sight of the most important thing, the difference between countries, where bourgeois democratic reforms have long been completed and those where they have not. Lenin attacks her treatment of the national question, saying, Rosa Luxemburg does not get her arguments to hang together, even on the question of the social structure of the government in Russia with regard to bourgeois Poland. As for the concrete historical specific features of the national movements in Russia, she does not even raise that question. And we read from Chapter 2, the historically concrete presentation of the question. Again, the categorical requirement of Marxist theory in investigating any social question is that it be examined within definite historical limits, and if it refers to a particular country, that is, the national program for a specific country, that account be taken of the specific features distinguishing that country from others in the same historical epoch. What does this categorical requirement of Marxism imply in its application to the question under discussion? First of all, it implies that a clear distinction must be drawn between the two periods of capitalism, which differ radically from each other as far as the national movement is concerned. On the other hand, on the one hand, there is the period of the collapse of feudalism and absolutism, the period of the formation of the bourgeois democratic society and state, when the national movements, for the first time, become mass movements, and in one way or another draw all classes of the population into politics through the press, participation in representative institutions, etc. This is, I think, what they refer to as the higher culture. On the other hand, there is the period of fully formed capitalist states with a long established constitutional regime and a highly developed antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. A period that may be called the eve of capitalism's downfall. He's saying, keep in mind, there's two different periods of capitalism. They're different, but it's still capitalism. But they're different. You got this period, and feudalism's disintegrating. Capitalism is rising. Capitalism is becoming the dominant form. You have the formation of the bourgeois democratic state and national movements. These national movements draw the population together. And then another period when those nations and states have developed into fully formed, developed capitalist states, where the antagonism between the proletariat and bourgeoisie is reaching a peak. You have to keep that in mind. If you don't keep that in mind, and you're talking about the national program of a nation, you're not serious. That's what Lenin's saying. And he says, the typical features of the first period are the awakening of national movements and the drawing of the peasants, the most numerous and the most sluggish section of the population, into these movements, in connection with the struggle for political liberty in general and for the rights of the nation in particular. Typical features of the second period are the absence of mass bourgeois democratic movements and the fact that developed capitalism, in bringing closer together nations that have already been fully drawn into commercial intercourse, wink, and causing them to intermingle to an increasing degree, brings the antagonism between the internationally united capital and the international working class movement into the forefront. The first period, typical feature is the struggle for the nation. Features of the second period are struggles for the international working class. He says, of course, the two periods are not walled off from each other. They are connected by numerous transitional links, the various countries differing from each other in the rapidity of their national development, in the national makeup and distribution of their population, and so on. Not to even mention when they start. Some nations begin forming after others are fully formed states. Reading on. There can be no question of the Marxists of any country drawing up their national program without taking into account all these general historical and concrete state questions. He says, shut your yap. You haven't done the math. No investigation, no right to speak. That's what he says, without saying it. Reading on. It is here that we come against the weakest point in Rosa Luxemburg's arguments. With extraordinary zeal, she embellishes her article with a collection of hard words directed at Clause 9 of our program, which she declares to be sweeping, a platitude, a metaphysical phrase, and so on without end. It would be natural to expect an author who so admirably condemns metaphysics, in the Marxist sense, that is, anti-dialectics, and empty abstractions, to set us an example of how to make a concrete historical analysis of the question. The question at issue is the national program of the Marxists of a definite country, Russia, in a definite period, the beginning of the 20th century. But does Rosa Luxemburg raise the question as to what historical period Russia is passing through? Or what are the concrete features of the national program and the national movements of that particular country in that particular period? No, Lenin says. She does not. She says absolutely nothing about it. Now, again, I haven't read this. I feel like at this point I'm obligated to go back and read Rosa's work. However, Lenin says about her work, in her work, you will not find even the shadow of an analysis of how the national question stands in Russia in the present historical period, or of the specific features of Russia in this particular respect. Okay, so I don't know. You might think he's being nitpicky of Rosa. Why is this important? Why is it? Who cares, Lenin? You're just picking on a woman because you don't like women. And I don't know. I seriously don't know enough about Lenin to say whether or not he had those kinds of feelings about women. Point is he being nitpicky? Or is what she said important? And is what she said wrong? And was Lenin right? What does history say about these arguments? These are things you're keeping in mind as you're reading this. And if you don't know these answers, like me, you're trying to find more historical context to support your analysis and your reading of theory. We read on. We are told that the national question in the Balkans is presented differently from that in Ireland. That Marx appraised the Polish and Czech national movements in the concrete conditions of 1848 in such and such a way. That Engels appraised, he says, a page of excerpts from Marx. He says that Engels appraised the struggle of the forest cantons of Switzerland against Austria and the Battle of Morgarten, which took place in 1315 in such and such a way, a page of quotations from Engels, with the appropriate comments from Kautsky. That Lassalle regarded the peasant war in Germany of the 16th century as reactionary, etc. That's what we're told. It cannot be said that these remarks and quotations have any novelty about them, but at all events, it is interesting for the reader to be occasionally reminded just how Marx, Engels, and Lassalle approached the analysis of concrete historical questions in individual countries. And a perusal of these instructive quotations from Marx and Engels reveals most strikingly the ridiculous position Rosa Luxemburg has placed herself in. She preaches eloquently and angrily the need for a concrete historical analysis of the national question in different countries at different times. But she does not make the least attempt to determine what historical stage in the development of capitalism Russia is passing through at the beginning of the 20th century, or what the specific features of the national question in this country are. Rosa Luxemburg gives examples of how others have treated the question in a Marxist fashion, as if deliberately stressing how often the road to hell is paved with good intentions and how often good counsel covers up unwillingness or inability to follow such advice in practice. Here is one of her edifying comparisons. In protesting against the demand for the independence of Poland, Rosa Luxemburg refers to a pamphlet she wrote in 1898, proving the rapid industrial development of Poland, with the latter's manufactured goods being marketed in Russia. Needless to say, no conclusion whatever can be drawn from this on the question of the right to self-determination. It only proves the disappearance of the old Poland from the landed gentry, etc. But Rosa Luxemburg always passes on imperceptibly to the conclusion that among the factors that unite Russia and Poland, the purely economic factors of modern capitalist relations now predominate. Then our Rosa proceeds to the question of autonomy, and though her article is entitled The National Question and Autonomy, in general, she begins to argue that the Kingdom of Poland has an exclusive right to autonomy. To support Poland's right to autonomy, Rosa Luxemburg evidently judges the state system of Russia by her economic, political, and sociological characteristics and everyday life. A totality of features which, taken together, produce the concept of Asiatic despotism. Is that what she calls it? Because Lenin uses quotes. He uses a reference. Perzoglad. Perzoglad. Is that right? He says, it's generally known that this kind of state system possesses great stability whenever completely patriarchal and pre-capitalist features dominate in the economic system, and where commodity production and class differentiation are scarcely developed. However, if in a country whose state system is distinctly pre-capitalist in character, there exists a nationally demarcated region where capitalism is rapidly developing, then the more rapidly the capitalism develops, the greater will be the antagonism between it and the pre-capitalist state system, and the more likely will be the separation of the progressive region from the whole, with which it is connected not by modern capitalistic, but by Asiatically despotic ties. I feel like I've got to read that like 12 times to. Is that one? It's like two sentences. It's so fucking dense. Okay, let's just read out here. He says, thus, Rosa Luxemburg does not get her arguments to hang together even on the question of the social structure of the government in Russia with regard to bourgeois Poland, as for the concrete historical specific features of the national movements in Russia, she does not even raise that question. And that is a point we must deal with now. We must now deal with. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 2, the historically concrete presentation of the question. Again, chapter 2. The risk of repeating myself here. First paragraph here represents the most important theoretical contribution by Lenin in the chapter, namely that the categorical requirement of Marxist theory in investigating any social question is that it be examined within definite historical limits. And if it refers to a particular country, for instance, the national program for a given country, that account be taken of the specific features distinguishing that country from others in the same historical epoch. And in using Rosa Luxemburg's writing as his primary vector for attacking similar arguments for, quote, losing sight of the most important thing, which is the difference between countries where bourgeois democratic reforms have long been completed and those where they have not. Lenin attacks her treatment of the national question, saying Rosa Luxemburg does not get her arguments to hang together, even on the question of the social structure of the government in Russia with regard to bourgeois Poland. As for the concrete historical specific features of the national movements in Russia, she does not even raise that question. Brings us to the end of chapter 2. If you feel like you got something out of this, feel free to support my content. It means a lot. Otherwise, we'll see you later in chapter 3. Love your face.